We're very excited about this next panel, which is about the latest in light-based additive manufacturing. So we'll hear a lot about photopolymers and light. I'm super excited. Our panel is moderated by Camila Uzcategaui. I think that's how you pronounce your name. Maybe not. You tell me. But we're so grateful to have you. Yeah, go ahead.
It is very close. It is Uzcategaui.
Uzcategaui. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. There's Dr. Callie Higgins. We'll have the rest of our panelists come up now. And I'll leave it to you all to introduce yourselves and moderate your panel. So thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you to TIPE and Women in 3D Printing. We are so excited for this panel. And we have some really amazing experts here with us to talk a little bit more about the latest in light-based additive manufacturing. So my name is Dr. Camila Uzcategaui. I am the co-founder and CEO of Feature 3D, and I'm also a postdoctoral research associate out of C Boulder. And I'm really excited to talk today about light-based additive manufacturing because I really see the potential and all the amazing work that has been done in this field. So traditionally, we define light-based additive manufacturing as a process that allows us to use light in order to be able to interact with resin and create a 3D structure, whether it's a layer by layer process or some new techniques such as volumetric additive manufacturing or also two photon processes. But I won't get too ahead of myself before introducing the amazing panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But we can go ahead and get started with Dr. Callie Higgins.
Well, thank you so much, Cami. It's a pleasure to be here and share the stage with all of these awesome women. Again, my name is Callie Higgins, and I am a scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. It's an organization that really exists to serve, U.S. commerce and just industry in general. So the research that we do just has to basically have impact in industry, which is really exciting. And I specialize in photopolymer additive, and the work that we do at NIST is very focused on trying to understand the fundamentals of these processes, specifically in the native environment, so in situ, inside of that liquid resin, and then once we understand how those properties develop, the idea is to reverse engineer them, and so that's the kind of crux of a lot of the work that we do.
Amazing. We'll go ahead to you, Dr. Tracy Schloemer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Schloemer, and I am a post research at Stanford University in sunny California. It's been real cloudy lately, but the sun's finally creeped out. So I am doing work. I'm a chemist by training, and I am in an electrical engineering department right now, working at the intersection of the printing work and photonics and a little bit of hardware. We'll say I dabble, and specifically towards using a process called triplet fusion up conversion for volumetric 3D printing.
Awesome. And Juliana, you can go ahead as well.
Hi, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana. I'm a Brazilian dentist. My specialty is orthodontist. So I'm a PhD student at the São Paulo State University, and I'm as well studying about 3D printing my PhD. So I work a lot with orthodontic aligners, and we use a lot of 3D printing to make the orthodontic aligners. In my PhD thesis, we're studying the development of resins to directly 3D print the aligners. So instead of 3D printing a lot of models, we are developing the resins to 3D print directly the aligner to try to make a more sustainable workflow in dentistry. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing.
Amazing. So as you all can see, we have a lot of diverse expertise here on the panel. And I want to really emphasize that our goal in this panel is to make this topic as engaging and applicable for as many as possible. So please do ask questions in the chat, engage with us, put things in the Q&A. I will be looking at that as I moderate. But to get us started, my first question for all the amazing panelists is, why should people care about light-based additive manufacturing? And anybody can go ahead and answer the question. You're muted, Callie.
Excellent. Gotta love that. You'd think I'd learn after almost 3 years. So I'm happy to start. So I have I kind of got into 3D printing, specifically this type of 3D printing about 10 years ago. And it was definitely much more in its infancy, which is interesting because it was invented in the 80s. But I think the patent had just gone up. And so all these companies were coming to market. And so there wasn't that many publications yet. And so it was an exciting time to really start diving into the research. And I think what I've started to recognize, and I think a lot of people in industry have started to recognize as well, is this specific type of 3D printing is just so unique in that once we understand the properties of these type of prints, or like in the native environment, we can then completely engineer a three-dimensional environment for, say, tissues or cell-like structures, such that we can control the chemistry, the mechanical properties, even magnetic properties in some cases. These technologies are really evolving so quickly. So I just see so much power in the capability and the potential that I'm excited to have so many awesome researchers coming onto the market.
Yes, I think this type of additive manufacturing is changing the whole manufacturing industry. We can make complex and personalized products with high precision and high speed. And talking about my area a little bit, this type of AM has changed the way the dentistry is made for the last 100 years. So now we can provide so much better care for our patients with better quality and high speed. So the patient has a much better product from us.
And just to add on to that, what can't you do? It really redefines the definition of rapid prototyping in a variety of fields. So to even just piggyback a little bit off of Juliana, obviously dental is a huge opportunity, but imagine 3D printing parts for our bodies that are truly personalized using stereolithography. And actually what's interesting, especially about biological based printing, there's a whole host of challenges and opportunities there, but really that size scale is a big challenge in getting the precision that's required. But the opportunities are endless when you want to actually prototype a product.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like I am so inspired by both the comments around what is capable in this type of 3D printing in terms of applications and tissue engineering and things that are really customized to our bodies, but also what is coming out and what is new in these new applications. And I'm actually going to take a question from the audience because I think it's really relevant, which is, what is your wish list for material properties you would like to see with photopolymer resins? And I think this question is a little deeper than surface level because it's really dependent on the light-based additive manufacturing method that you're using. So some wish lists for volumetric printing, for example, which is something that we work on in our lab, is we want the material to be transparent. We need light to be able to go through it, which might be very different for other light-based additive manufacturing techniques. So I'll pose a question to all of you. What is your wish list for material properties? I think my first one right now is transparency. I'd go with mechanical properties and making sure that we are able to control them and characterize them quite well. But what about you, Callie? What do you think?
Yeah, so that's an awesome question. And I think, you highlighted it very well. It's so dependent on the technology and also the application. That's what I think is so powerful about this specific type of printing, is that it's not just isolated to, say, tissue engineering or automotive applications or, a whole host of other applications. And so, for instance, if we're trying to put this part into a car, we need the part to be not have high UV degradation. And so, because car parts get exposed to lots of light, and so it can't degrade rapidly over time in sunlight. And that's just an interesting use case that I just wouldn't have necessarily realized that we needed to do that fatigue kind of test. Whereas in tissue engineering, every tissue needs very different properties and components that need to be inside those initial materials. But the beauty of this technique is that I really see that we will have the flexibility to actually print this whole host of different properties, and really target, for tissue engineering purposes specifically, very unique tissues. Like, so say bone, for instance, we can engineer those kinds of moduli and chemical structures. And then same thing goes for, let's say that we need to recapitulate cartilage, which I know, Cammy, you have a lot of expertise in. So it's all very different, but targeting specific applications is really critical.
I like to give in this context, when you think about, for instance, typical stereolithography that, form labs that you can buy off the shelf, you think about the resin itself before it's cured. It's really thin, right? It flows really well. Whereas for those of us who have transitioned and are working in volumetric 3D printing, one resin property that we need to see is actually that the resin needs to be very viscous, and it must self-support the print, for instance. So that's an example of an unexpected property, especially those of you who are familiar with something like a form labs where you're printing layer by layer at the surface versus in a volumetric fashion.
I think for me it's the same. It depends on what you're using the 3D printing. Even in healthcare industry, we have so many applications. In dentistry, some materials we need to put inside the mouth of the patient, and some we don't. So the biological properties are different. So for me, right now, in our resin to 3D print directly the aligners, we also need transparency and in specific type of flexibility. So it's very hard to combine all the characteristics to have the material you want.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I am going to move to one of my questions, but we will come back to the Q&A. And I think this is a great segue, which is, what are some recent advances in industry or academia that you're really excited about that could potentially address some of these challenges and applications? And I'll pass it to Tracy just to mix things up a little bit.
So some current challenges.
And some current advances based on
this challenges,
hopefully.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna, in the world of volumetric 3D printing is where I'm gonna focus, and I'm gonna share really brief, shameless plug for the work I'm doing, but also highlight some really other amazing work. So one recent advance from our group and from a few other groups is using interesting photonic materials that are capable of nonlinear optical processes. And that's just a really fancy way of saying, for instance, I can take, in my case, 2 low energy photons, or like red light, to generate 1 blue photon, which then is absorbed by the photoinitiator and can do the curing that many of us all know and love. And so it's been really exciting to see advances there, both on the nanoscale. So think like a nanoscribe. And then also really starting to tiptoe with some interesting tweaks there, really be able to tiptoe in some of these challenging size domains. So think about printing on, the size of a dice for a game, so about 1 centimeter cubed. So there's some really exciting advances there, and some other. I'm gonna share 3 things. So that was 1. So using interesting photonic materials. 2, amazing optics engineering for volumetric 3D printing. So for instance, there is a group out in Europe, in Hecht, and he has a company now. If you're out there, sorry if I mispronounced your name, but anyways, they have a really beautiful example of using a molecular photo switch to gate the printing process. So you have 2 perpendicular wavelengths of light that you can shine, and then based on the molecular configuration or just the shape of your photo switch, based on how you've patterned the light, you can also do some cool volumetric 3D printing. So 3rd cool advance, and then I will let other people talk, is a different technology called CLIP. And so if you've heard of Carbon 3D, Jody Simone has just joined us at Stanford, and Carbon 3D is right down the street, and they're doing some really, really cool work towards nanostructures. And for instance, imagine getting a vaccine with just a little patch that's been 3D printed instead of having to get a shot. So anyways, those are some 3 amazing, diverse examples, 2 of them in volumetric 3D printing.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing, Tracy. What about you, Juliana? What are you getting excited about happening right now?
I'm really excited about volumetric 3D printing as well. As I told you before, I'm new at the volumetric 3D printing, so I have just started studying a little bit. As I said, here in Brazil, it's very, very new. 3D printing got here a little bit later than in the United States. So, but I'm very excited from what I'm reading, from what I'm learning with you. I think it's really gonna revolutionize the way we 3D print from now on. And I'm really excited about more sustainable resins, 3D printing resins that are being developed oil-based resins that make the material less toxic and makes we do not waste so much material. So I'm studying a little bit about these oil-based resins. We have a lot of projects here in Brazil with different kinds of oils that we have here, and I'm really excited about it. And I think in the future we will see a lot more of that instead of the regular resins. I think it makes a little bit sense.
Mm-hmm. I know that's what's so exciting about this field, is that there are so many different approaches to this technology. Like they're just, like I work with a lot of people that study metal additive, and it's such metals are very well characterized, like in terms of the fundamental physics of them, whereas polymers are just this whole basket of unknowns. And then you add the conversion as a process that needs to be controlled and understood. And so it definitely opens up a lot of questions, but also a lot of possibilities. And so I think one other additional kind of different perspective, I guess, on developments in this field that is getting me very excited is the fact that other industries are starting to invest in the technology. So, you have a company that specializes in tissue engineering, for instance. They have no background in 3D printing, but all of a sudden they're starting to interact more with specifically 3D printing companies because, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So let's now get the best and most brilliant minds in the tissue engineering world and combine them with our amazing, material scientists. And all of a sudden we can have a very productive and possibly like world-changing, tissue engineering research going forward. And so I think that's been really helpful and important in terms of pushing this field forward, because I think these companies are starting to recognize a lot of the value in the printing itself and a lot of investment. And so the investment part is the most, that's the most important in terms of progress, because otherwise we're not going to make a ton of progress if there isn't funding. And so I think it's not necessarily specific to the technology itself, but it's really a critical piece to make this a successful technology.
Absolutely. I feel like this kind of covered a lot of those aspects and how broad the field is.
Yeah. One question I just have, really, just as a follow-up to Tracy, because you mentioned my background is optics, so my training is optics, so I really love that I get so excited to talk more with optics people. And one interesting question that I have for you is with using this multiphoton or triplet state kind of up conversion, depends on what state you're using, but technology is throughput. So if you need 2 photons for every single polymerization event, or initiating event, I'm just curious as to how you guys are tackling that low throughput that has generally been associated with multiphoton or 2-photon techniques.
Gosh, I feel like I want you all to know that this is not a planted question. Okay, I'm so grateful for this question. It's an awesome question. So for our work in particular, so just to give a really brief context, if you Google nanoscribe, this is a commercially available technology that you can print. You know, if you've ever seen those amazing 3D prints of, you know, like a castle on a pencil tip, you know, and things like that, that was probably printed with something using 2 photon absorption based polymerization. If you have an extra couple $1 million laying around, you can have your own nanoscribe just for you. And maybe let me know, because maybe I'll use it too. But anyway, so the nanoscribe is limited. It's an amazing technology, first and foremost. It's an amazing thing. You're limited to very, very small size scales, and you're limited to slow speeds because they rely on molecules simultaneously absorbing 2 photons to generate 1 high energy photon that then is absorbed by the photoinitiator and then does the printing. And so it is slow because that process is really unlikely. You're also using pulsed lasers, so you have heating issues, and all of this kind of culminates in very small volumes and very, very slow prints. So for context, something on the scale of 1 millimeter cubed, which this is too big, like I can't really well demonstrate that. You can always play with the parameters, but it's going to take you a few hours for an average case. You can make it take longer. You could maybe make it a little shorter, but on the scale of a few hours. So anyways, so back to your question, Callie, I just wanted to give the audience a little context. For the work that we're doing, it is a net 2 photon, but I'm not going to go into the photophysics. It's amazing. It's magical. Google it. But triplet fusion up conversion. But ultimately, each molecule has just a single photon absorption. So basically, it's much more efficient. So instead of for 2 photon absorption, the power densities required are like 10 to the 12th. The unit doesn't matter. It's just really big. We can print we have a couple of optical setups. One of them is just a hacked FDM printer, where instead of the extrusion nozzle, we glued a laser and an optical train. I medium. I don't recommend it at all. And so we can print kind of like a little 1 grain of rice at a time. For instance, for those of you who've calibrated 3D printers, we printed Benchy in just under 2 hours. That's a cube scale, so that's 1,000 times larger. Now we also built a DMD printer, and when I say we, I want to give credit where credit is due to some of my colleagues, and now I have learned about it in our group. But we can print 2D objects using a digital micromirror device, which is just a projection system. And we, instead of using a laser at 10 to the 5th power, you know, we're, a few orders of magnitude lower than that. And then in the order of 30 seconds or less, depending on the power density. So yeah, so much faster, much faster, much lower power densities are accessible.
And what was the resolution on that? Because you were mentioning one of the favorable aspects of it was the fact that you could keep that high resolution.
Yeah, and
like
so
technologies are
we make an estimate, tens of microns. We make an estimate. There's the optics and the resin in our case really dictate the resolution. Right. And so these are home built printers, so that's part of it. And then the other part is for those of you who have just built your own brand new thing, it's amazing. The work we've done is amazing. It's reproducible, and it's also a prototype. And so we have challenges with the lifetime of our resin. So going back to the resin properties, I wish my resin was more stable. Have to use it that day. And so we have challenges there right now. But we're really excited. You know, that's what it means to be on the edge of something new, is that smarter people can take this and take their expertise and make it better.
That's amazing. Thank you for that discussion. I do want to point out that in the chat, everybody would like to see the nano benchy. So I hope that there's a way to disseminate an image. So there's a couple more questions in the Q&A. The one with the most upvotes is, are there bio-based or homemade photopolymer resins out there? I know that there are some resins that are being derived from materials that are out in nature. But I want to see what the panelists have to say.
So from my experience, we have some soy oil-based resins that we can use. But these are the only ones I have seen, the soy oil-based resins, and there are some that are being developed. I have a side project in my PhD that we are trying to transform wasted cooking oil in 3D printing resin. So we are trying to develop a resin from wasted oil, and we are walking in that direction. But I think we're gonna it's possible. So I think it's a promising area, and more we'll have more bio-based resins.
Do any of the other panelists have any thoughts on the bio-based resin?
I mean, I think there's a lot of investment. I think there's a lot of people that want to do it. I guess I'm not sure about what the homemade aspect means. But in terms of just like bio-based and like, something that's, more recyclable, like there's a lot of motivation, and there are, substantial number of researchers that are devoted to, that space. But I think commercially they're not as available yet as other traditional not bio-based resins out there. But there is enough motivation, I think, from a lot of different governments specifically for sustainable technologies and just sustainable materials like this, that I could see there being a substantial growth in that market in the next couple of years.
Just to also comment on that, I wonder, and no one has to respond to this maybe, but, what is the definition of a bio-based resin? And just thinking about how do we even define it, because I'll bet you might be able to find something, but depending, but it gets complicated really quickly. Think of how we throw out the word organic in our society. So bio-based is maybe hopefully a really positive attribute, but it depends what you want to do with it. And it also depends where you're sourcing it as well. So as, you and we all continue, that's just something for us to think about.
Thank you for that, Tracy. Go ahead, Juliana.
No, I think maybe they're talking about biodegradable resin. So we have a few on the market.
That is different than how I interpreted that question.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes. When you're talking about the chemistry of the resin, there are different properties, but about that as well.
Thank you for saying that, Juliana, and I really appreciate your comment, Tracy, as well, because we need to be really intentional with language when it comes to kind of describing these resins. And there is a question in the Q&A if there are any biocompatible or biodegradable photopolymer resins. And I know we've done some work at CU that we've been able to print with polybeta amino ester resins and been able to use that type of chemistry to get a broad range of degradable behaviors. So we've seen degradability on the order of 30 minutes, over to 48 hours, and even longer, and both in bulk degradation as well as surface-based degradation. So there's a lot of tricks you can play with chemistry in order to make them degradable and also tune that degradability. So that's some of our experience with it in those tissue engineering applications. But I know, Juliana, you talked about it briefly, if there are any other degradable resins that you all have worked with.
Biocompatible and biodegradable, I have known a little bit about the biodegradable, but that are biocompatible as well. I don't know any in my field.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of biocompatible and biodegradable materials out there specifically for tissue engineering. You can engineer materials to be hydrolytically degradable, so just degrade by water. And so I've used a fair bit of those specifically in my PhD. And I think that, Cami, you have a lot of experience with those as well. And it just, again, it really just boils down to the application space that you're trying to use. And biodegradable is one thing, but like what happens to these subcomponents? You know, it can be biodegradable, but what do you do with those waste products? Can they be reused? That's totally different. And so that's kind of something also that needs to be kind of defined in terms of are we operating in. But all of these are like separate, very difficult problems and challenges that I think the market is definitely posed to start to answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add on to it, also, what is the accessibility of being able to degrade these materials, right? So you think of a biological implant, you know, that's been well engineered in advance to degrade at a certain rate, and hopefully those byproducts are metabolized well. But when you think about, you know, just mainstream, can we reuse these things? You know, are they accessible on a consumer individual scale? Or are they really only accessible on an industrial scale because you need the volume to make it cost effective? So those are things that we talk about.
Yeah, and one little last caveat I'd like to add to that question is something that I will take from my scientific advisor, which is, what does biocompatible even mean? And we should go and talk about cytocompatible, because it's all going to be specific to the cells that the material is interacting with. So something might be compatible with blood cells, but it might not be compatible with bone cells. So I think moving into kind of cytocompatibility and testing whether it's compatible with a specific cell type for the specific application will end up being more relevant than this broader kind of biocompatible umbrella. But that's a little nitpicky. I just wanted to throw that in there. So there's another question here that I think is really interesting, which is 3D printing materials and printers are more devoted to plastic materials and metals. So I'm thinking of like selective laser sintering or any of the light-based additive manufacturing we've talked about here. And they're asking why and what are the challenges for rubbery / elastomeric materials based 3D printing. And I have some ideas, but I've talked a little bit too much right now. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Callie. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a fair bit of experience in this, you know, trying to understand the space of materials that we can print, specifically for photopolymer additive. But we can print rubbery and viscoelastic materials. That's kind of the beauty of the technology. And plastics can be both of those, rubbery and elastomeric. But some of the challenges that inherent to these structures is that they do have, because they're rubbery at room temperature, that means that their glass transition temperature is associated, you know, it's obviously we're operating in a different area than say a very stiff plastic. And this makes it challenging because it changes the properties of the material before it's printed. So you have a lot of diffusion that's happening during the process. You have a lot of swelling that can happen during the printing process. And all of these influence the fidelity of the print and ultimately your throughput. And so it's definitely a challenge, but that's one of the things that I think this field and this technology specifically can tackle, because you have the flexibility to even print these materials though. I know that FDM has, or not necessarily FDM, but SLS has done some work in this space because they have a little bit different flexibility. But I think that we definitely are currently printing those types of materials. It's just a matter of overcoming some of these, like, you know, inherent challenges in the reaction process.
While I'm not in this space, something that I just see as has been a significant challenge is also interfaces of composite materials. You know, you can have material 1, material 2 with whatever properties, and Callie just talked about even the challenges in defining bulk properties in a material, which are the simpler properties to define. It's always tough, but really marrying to really print composite materials that are used all around us.
I would argue even that every single print that you have is a degree a composite material, because every single layer in volumetric it's obviously different because you have absorptive properties and polymerization that's not quite so dependent on where you're shining light from. But for traditional SLS or SLA rather, or like, you know, projection-based systems, you are inherently engineering the material to have a gradient in mechanical and chemical properties at every single
that's fair. That's fair.
Bulk properties are, you know, we don't even, bulk properties are out the window for us. Like that doesn't, that there's no real scenario in which a bulk property, I think, can make sense, because, you know, once you change the layer thickness or the properties of the resin, it totally changes the whole thing. And so it is exactly, but that's that is the challenge, is understanding what happens. Like, how do you make sure that you have proper adhesion between these composite structures? And I think that kind of highlights and points to one of the questions in the Q&A, which is talking about ceramic-based materials.
Yes.
Those are just so challenging, because you have they're inherently going to, you know, either, you know, absorb light or deflect light in a manner that makes it very difficult to polymerize any kind of thick structure. But there is substantial research that's actually going on in the field right now to print you know, these kinds of ceramic-based structures, and I think, you know, it's challenging, but there's some interesting work that's going on to actually use some of these particles as almost lensing particles, so that you can, you know, wrap the light around the particles and then send the light to polymerize the resin that's surrounding these ceramics. And so that's interesting. I mean, it's obviously still research-based, but I think it's a challenging but very important research direction that the field is starting to get into.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, so maybe let's go on to the next one. And I see, which light-based technology do you see the most applicable to larger scale industrial printing, e.g. pumping out multiple models on a single bed, and what is the best resolution achievable? So the first thing that comes to mind for me is what Azul 3D is doing. They have this really amazing technology where they have really large format 3D printing, and because of all of the heat that is generated because of this really large format, they have a very special way of ensuring that heat does not add up with this oil-based bath underneath. So it's kind of the first thing that comes up for me, and I know that they're really trying to move into these larger industrial printing applications. But what comes up for the other panelists?
No, go ahead, Juliana. No, I was waiting.
No, you can talk. I don't work in the large scale industry, but I agree with what Camille said, and I think the light-based AM has a lot of different sizes of printing that we can do, that we can make. Large industries in dentistry, we use large light-based AM printers in our field, and I think that's it. We have, as we work with very small pieces, we need to have high resolution. So we work with DLP printers really well in large scale with very high resolution.
From my West Coast United States perspective, I mean, and again, this question, it depends what you want, but what is challenging about Carbon 3D is that you can lease an instrument or they will print it for you. So I don't know if this question was geared towards truly like an industrial scale, or like, hey, this is a large scale thing I can access. So it's less accessible to the public. But I mean, you can buy Nike shoes that are printed by Carbon 3D. And I think I'm not cool enough to wear them, but people are very excited about them. You know, they have collaborations. The way, and then in terms of, they have collaborations with other large industrial partners. It's $1 billion company. What is really interesting to me as I see some of the, research scale stuff that people are doing here, about resolution. And this is flabbergasting. Now, resolution costs you time, like I am taking up right now speaking, but And the Z resolution is typically the most challenging for any type of printing, just hands down. And their Z resolution is, for all intents and purposes, can be infinitesimally small, which is baffling to me. And I'm not versed on the mathematics, but it's something I directly asked a researcher giving a talk about, because they neglected to say something. And then they're like, oh, because we don't really have issues with that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And then from a different from taking it from a different perspective, I think one of the, there's a lot of focus on, okay, so how big of a print can you actually end up making? But in working with a lot of companies, what I've come to recognize is that's not the bottleneck in any of these fabrication techniques. It is the post-processing that is the bottleneck. So once we can define and design these structures to have minimized post-processing or expedited post-processing, that's when we'll have the most gains, because you can parallelize printers like nobody's business, or have a large format printer to print a giant structure. But if we're talking about mainstream manufacturing, the process has to be focused. We have to focus on the post-processing that's required for a lot of this printing. And I think that's where a lot of people don't want to use this type of printing, because there is a non-negligible post-processing system. We use carcinogenic materials, and some of the most common photoinitiators that we're using, the FDA just said, no, those are all carcinogenic. We need to figure out ways to dispose of that. And that's huge. That's like crippling for an industry. And so if there are ways to kind of overcome that, because once it's polymerized into a structure, it's no longer carcinogenic, obviously. But if it's still in resin form, that's where we have a lot of complications. And so figuring out unique ways to tackle that challenge, I think, is a big question in the field, and will definitely, once we start to answer that, it will expedite the useful, or the utility of it as a specifically mainstream manufacturing technology. But right now, if we're talking about singular one-off prints, for instance, dental liners, it's the perfect technology for that, because it doesn't need to be crazy high throughput. It doesn't need to print a million of these things. You just need one very specific to that patient. And so that's a perfect use case for the technology as it is right now. And so I think timing the applications is also a very important context to think about where this type of printing will live long term for industry generally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that I'm hearing is not only is it the printing process itself, but it's also the post-processing. And then when we talk about kind of larger scale industrial applications, back to our original discussion, it really just depends on what the application is and what does large scale mean. And the second part of the question is, what is the best resolution achievable? It's going back to that. Its application, it is hardware based, it is material based, because that interaction between light and material is going to determine your resolution, because of diffusion, because of all of these amazing things happening during the 3D printing process, which we've all written papers about. So we're getting to the last 3 minutes, and there are some really amazing and interesting questions we did not get to. So I really encourage you to reach out to us with these questions and follow up. We're all very excited to talk about light-based additive manufacturing, as you can probably tell. So in these last couple of minutes, I just wanted all of the panelists to go around and just tell us, what high-level idea do you want the audience to walk away with from this panel? And we can go ahead and start with you, Juliana.
Everybody could have a great idea from where we are in, basically here, from the simple idea to the high level idea, what we are talking about. And I think we have to look to the future, to what is going to, how can we benefit from this type of technology. And I think, as you're saying, volumetric 3D printing is very promising. And I think we're gonna hear a lot from it, and it will keep growing, and so that everybody can access it, and everybody can have access to the information and to the technology. So I think we have to spread this word that everybody should have the access to the technology, as well as the information to use the technology.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Tracy? What would you like for the audience to walk away with?
The sky's the limit, and it depends what you want to achieve. with this technology. And I really look forward to seeing really clever, smart people continue to tackle some of the challenges and opportunities brought up in this talk.
And lastly, and Dr. Callie Higgins.
Thank you. So Tracy, that's such a good point. I feel like the sky is the limit. And I think to kind of sober it down a little bit, I think we need to understand that a lot of research has to be, devoted to this technology. But if we put in the work and kind of on the front end, then I think that the potential we will reach that potential. And also, if we're talking about it, because all of us are researchers, but for those who are in industry that are in this talk, we recognize that regulation is a huge portion of this specific type of printing, and we are aware and we are working on that. And so take that away, and please reach out to all of us. And I'm always happy to talk, because specifically, I work in a standards field, and so we are working with regulators. We're not a regulatory agency, obviously, but we are working with regulators to try to understand what the field needs to really, really move forward. So I definitely am excited to see where this kind of where we all end up converging at the end of this.
Well, thank you, ladies, so much for the spirited discussion. I loved it so much. You're all amazing. Thank you again. And this concludes this block for the technology track. There's a couple hours of networking, and then we'll start back up at 7 p.m. Eastern, which is 4 p.m. Pacific. Feel free to join then. Thanks again, ladies.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.